call the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Fair Work Amendment Bill 2024. Now, many small businesses in Warringah are struggling right now. Some are even closing entirely. At the end of 2023, we have local institutions in Mosman shut up shop, including Brunskills Pharmacy, Faire, Shane's Butchery, Adan Cafe, so a vast variety of small businesses. They have been local favourites for over 30 years. And whilst there are a lot of pressures facing small and medium-sized businesses right now, inflation, utility bills, less consumer spending, one other thing I always hear about when visiting small businesses is the difficulty and the complexity of navigating our industrial relations laws and their fear of getting it wrong and the fact that it is constantly changing. The government has now pushed through several legislative packages of major changes to our industrial relations laws, some of which we are still working through. And it makes it difficult for small businesses to operate, and especially when only about 43% of them are even breaking even. This bill is a classic example of the government doing a Senate deal and now rushing through the legislation. And I would argue it's poor policy, it hasn't been thought through, it hasn't been properly consulted on. So the government is now having to clean up what happened through the rushed process. It only gives uncertainty and angst for businesses, and it's not how we should be making policy in Australia. I respect the right to disconnect for employees, but by legislating it in this rushed way that we have, and we are now having to fix it, we are going to see unintended consequences. So, many have heard about it in the media. What is the right to disconnect? It gives employees a right to disconnect from their employer's unreasonable contact outside of work hours. The difficulty, of course, will be the definition of unreasonable contact and how that is interpreted. It's partly a response to smartphones and work from home blurring the lines between work and personal life. We know over the last few years with COVID, many things have changed in our workplaces. And whilst it's incredibly important to get that balance right, by legislating it in this way, we are at risk of creating a real minefield for businesses. So the right to disconnect amendment to the government's legislation came only from Senate deliberations. It was not part of the suite of legislation put to the House. It was not part of a consultation process with COSBOA or BCA or the business lobby groups. It hasn't really had the full consideration in the House before the government legislated it in the Senate. And so now we see it coming back to the House from the other place because in fact we're having to pass this additional legislation because of unintended consequences, the effect of rushing it, which is that there is a criminal sanction in relation to this provision. So no one disagrees that employees need time to switch off. But we need to balance that with also the need to getting the jobs done, productivity, and how businesses operate in a modern era with smartphones and that need to balance out flexibility and being connected. COVID-19 pandemic saw a huge change in the way many Australians work day to day. These changes have meant newfound flexibility for many, and that does make it harder to disconnect. Nevertheless, we don't want to lose this flexibility that many employers and employees alike value because it has helped on both sides. For example, many women or families having to deal with family commitments, needing to leave the workplace, needing to request a more flexible arrangement. But then the converse is also true, that for employers, the difficulty of then knowing what is going to be considered unreasonable contact and the times, and then that willingness to provide more flexibility in relation to working arrangements. So if this change in the law is used in a vexatious manner, which, let's get real, does happen, it will absolutely spook employers in winding back the flexible working arrangements that so many have come to enjoy. So this amendment has been rushed, and we know unintended consequences arise out of well-intentioned policy making but rushed process. The Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry has stated that this sort of amendment is a blunt instrument which will do more harm than good. They've highlighted a tension where technology has afforded employees more freedom to work unusual hours or are physically not on site, but also assured employers that they are contactable if needed. That shows there is a level of nuance here, and that is worthy of greater scrutiny in order to get the right policy balance. So how do we get here? Why must the government do this additional legislative clean-up? So the second tranche of the government's Closing the Loopholes legislation established the right to disconnect. This was established in the debate in the Senate for this legislation, where an amendment was sought to be made by the government to make clear that parties who breach a right to disconnect order issued by the Fair Work Commission do not commit, in fact, a criminal offence. However, as so often happens here, politicians, shenanigans, posturing were afoot, and the government were not granted leave for this amendment to be moved. So instead, we are taking up time in the House to now have an additional bill to do what that amendment was trying to do in the first place. So this bill simply fixes that. It makes sure that non-compliance is a civil rather than a criminal offence, which should have been done via amendment in the first place. But it does bring to light that broader problem in relation to this legislation and the process for the government in how these changes have occurred. So this bill it relates to the bill passed by the Senate a few weeks ago. And there's great concern in relation to some of the changes in relation to casuals. It did not give us enough, the government didn't give enough opportunity to speak on the amended legislation at the time. In fact, used its numbers to gag debate and rush it through, which is rather hypocritical, I should say, in light of having been in this place myself during the last term of government, where the shoe was on the other foot and the now government complained about being gagged in those days. And so good policy making requires scrutiny and requires debate time. The definition of casual employee and the conversion process have been amended in a way that is more palatable and so hopefully practical for employees and employers. And that would have been something would have been enjoyed the opportunity to actually debate when that bill came back from the Senate. So now there's one conversion process initiated by an employee. So that simplification is good. Businesses, and this was a kind of amendment that had been pushed for in their House, but as so often happens, was only agreed to by the government in the other place. Businesses only have to act on converting an employee from casual to part or full-time if they receive a notification from the employee. Employees can initiate this after 6 months working for bigger businesses and after 12 months working for small and medium enterprises. So this highlights yet another industrial relation issue we have, which is that there are currently 12 definitions of small business in Commonwealth legislation. We will have more to say on this, and I'm urging the government to address that problem. So changes to the casual conversion process echo the amendments that the crossbench in the House had offered. And it's good to see that our efforts had some impact since they were then agreed to in the other place. So overall, the changes that affect casual workers are not what is needed right now, I would argue, especially for small businesses in light of current economic circumstances. They will still create complexity, uncertainty and more pressure for many that are already struggling to break even. Small businesses will continue to feel this pressure well into 2024. Now, one of the biggest concerns I had with the original legislation was also in relation to employee-like status and that threshold. So this has also been amended in the other place, but of course we did not get the opportunity to comment on those amendments because the government elected to gag debate. To be an employee-like worker, a person must satisfy 2 or more of the listed criteria, rather than 1 as in the original bill. There have now been some sensible changes introduced, refining what may be included for the Fair Work Commission to look at who is an employee-like worker and the scope of matters that will be included in minimum standard orders. This is a move in the right direction and provides more precision that existed in the original legislation. However, it is still a massive and complex change to the IR framework that will be complex and difficult for many to understand and implement. And with complexity comes uncertainty. So many of my constituents and businesses in Warringah will be affected by this new piece of legislation in relation to the right to disconnect, and quite possibly not in a positive way. So I would argue to the government we must look to ease the burden and red tape on our business owners, big and small. If we keep passing complex legislation that is rushed and not properly consulted, then we are making it harder for business and entrepreneurs to succeed in Australia. We need to get back to basics, draft exposures of legislation for consultation, genuine engagement with a variety of stakeholders, listening to feedback and incorporating it to make our laws better. If we don't, we will continue to waste the time of this House on legislative cleanups.